One of the topics on which we have most focused over the last year or so is the rising authoritarianism in all Western countries, including the United States, in the name of protecting and defending the state of Israel from criticism, from journalism, from activism that might in some way reflect poorly on Israel or undermine their political interests. One of the sites that does that most effectively is the Electronic Intifada, and that outlet has a reporter, Asa Winsternly, who frequently reports in a very effective way, very critical way on Israel, its war in Gaza, and the war in Lebanon. And recently, this last week, in fact, earlier this week, he had British police show up at his door, pound on the door, and then come in and seize all of his electronic equipment, telling him that they were investigating whether or not he was in violation of something called the Terrorism Act of 2000. And there's been other types of censorship, other attempts to criminalize journalism and activism and reporting that's aimed at criticizing Israel throughout the West. And the founder and the director of the Electronic Intifada, who is Ali Abdulnima, who is a good friend of mine and a friend of the show that I've known for a long time, is with us tonight to talk about all of that, as well as everything else happening with the latest wars from Israel and the U.S. role in it. Ali, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on tonight.
Thank you, Glenn. It's my pleasure.
So let's talk about Asa. First of all, the reporter who works at the Electronic Intifada for a long time, is a very well-respected, long-time British journalist whose journalistic methods are very common, very solid, and reliable. I've cited his work a long time. But for those who aren't familiar with him, just tell us a little bit about his background and then what specifically happened earlier this week with the British police.
Yeah, Asa Winsternly is a fantastic investigative journalist. He's one of the most important investigative journalists working today, and so we're very proud that he's our colleague at the Electronic Intifada. Among his many important pieces of journalism is his book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, How the Israel Lobby Helped to Bring Down Jeremy Corbyn, which documents how the Israel lobby and the British deep state, for want of a better word, colluded to fabricate an anti-Semitism crisis in the UK in order to smear Jeremy Corbyn, an independent-minded, moderately left-wing leader who rose to become, by popular acclaim, huge landslide popular votes, the leader of the main opposition, as it was at the time, Labour Party. And Corbyn was also, of course, a lifelong campaigner for Palestinian rights. So that's one of Asa's great achievements, is completely busting this fraud and hoax of a crisis of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. His most recent article for the Electronic Intifada, published on October 7th this year, the anniversary of the Palestinian resistance operation and the beginning of the Israeli genocide, is at the Electronic Intifada, and it's headlined, How Israel Killed Hundreds of Its Own People on 7 October. And it shows, with meticulous documentation based on our reporting for a year, and this is all based on Israeli sources, how Israel applied the so-called Hannibal Doctrine on October 7th, which is a military directive that allows Israeli forces to kill their own people, soldiers and civilians, in order to prevent them being taken captive. And that was responsible for hundreds of the deaths on October 7th, a fact not really contested in Israel, but which is totally absent from Western narratives and mainstream media. So that's the type of journalism that Asa does.
So, and by the way, I mean, we've covered that here as well. Just last week, Barack Obama said, today we commemorate the 1,400 people who were killed by Hamas on October 7th. Abigail Shrier, who works at Barry Weiss's The Free Press, said 1 year ago, 1,400 Israeli civilians were killed by Hamas. And of course, the death toll was reduced and reduced. It's now about 1,100 people, 350 of whom were active duty IDF soldiers. So at most, there's about 650, 700 people, actual civilians who were killed that day. And as you say, a not non-trivial portion of them were actually killed by the IDF in applying this doctrine that says it's better to kill our own citizens than permit them to be kidnapped. And there's almost nobody in the United States who even knows this. Now, I want to talk about what happened specifically at Asa's house, what the police did and what they said in response to perhaps that reporting that you just mentioned or the body of work that he's been doing. What can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so this happened on Thursday, October 17th. Asa got a knock on his door at just before 6 a.m. London time. He lives in London. And there were 10 officers from the counter-terrorism division of the Metropolitan Police. That's the main police force in the UK. And they served him with 2 search warrants, one for his house and one for his vehicle, to seize all electronic devices connected with his journalism and any notes or documents connected with his journalism that they wanted to take. And that's exactly what they did. And they told him that this investigation has been going on for a year and that it was connected with his social media posts. Now that raises an immediate question: is if it's about his social media posts, which we can talk about how absurd it is that it's a criminal offense to say things online in the UK, to hold certain opinions and to express them online. Well, if it's about his social media posts, why do they need to seize all his electronic devices when they can just read his Twitter feed? But they did seize all his electronic devices, including the devices he uses for his journalism, and that may well contain information about sources and other privileged material that would be typically in the possession of a journalist. And they now have all of that equipment. They have seized it after raiding his home under these search warrants.
We've seen a lot of examples in the UK in particular, but other countries as well, where police show up at people's homes to interrogate them about social media posts they've expressed about a whole wide range of issues. But it's intensified a great deal over the last year, specifically by targeting critics of Israel. But what really caught my attention about this story was the use of the Terrorism Act of 2000 to say that that was a potential law that he may have violated. And as you, I think, recall, I have a lot of personal experience with that because during the Snowden reporting, when my husband was working on this reporting with me and came back home through Heathrow, he was detained under that Terrorism Act of 2000 for 11 hours, was constantly threatened with prosecution for terrorism, and we were all very confounded about how a terrorism charge could be invoked or even investigation when he was working on the Snowden reporting, which multiple media outlets were around the world and ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize for public service. And we sued, and although the court said that they had the right to detain him under British law was in conflict with the EU law because the Terrorism Act can't be used for journalists. Now, I think that's a different provision because that was for airport detention than probably they use for Asa's home. But let me just say what if I'm understanding correctly, what they're essentially saying, and actually Ron DeSantis used this rationale in order to order all student groups for justice in Palestine shut down and through the University of Florida system, was that if you start criticizing Israel, reporting on Israel in a way that crosses some imaginary line in the head of government officials, you cross the line and you actually start, quote unquote, encouraging terrorism, even though you're only speaking and expressing your views, and then that becomes a crime. You're saying, you're criticizing Israel so much that you're basically helping Hamas or Hezbollah through what it is that you're saying. It's basically a way that the government can just sort of secretly on their own decide that a particular view can be criminalized as terrorism. Is this what it seems like they're doing in this case?
Yeah, just to clarify something, the UK has multiple terrorism acts. There is the Terrorism Act of 2000 and there is the Terrorism Act of 2006. And in the documents that the police served on Asa when they raided his home, they cite the Terrorism Act of 2006, not the Terrorism Act of 2000.
Right, and David was detained under the 2001.
Right. And they both do contain some similar provisions. But in the specific case of Asa, they are citing provisions of the Terrorism Act of 2006, and this is, they actually gave him a copy of this part of the Terrorism Act of 2006, sections 1 and 2, which purport to criminalize something called encouragement of terrorism. And if you look at what legal authorities and human rights groups that focus on this say, they say that this provision of encouragement of terrorism is extremely broad and basically criminalizes any kind of speech the government doesn't like. Human Rights Watch has actually called for this provision of the Terrorism Act 2006 to be repealed because it basically infringes on any notion or any obligation to uphold free speech. And the way the British authorities have been using these kinds of provisions, including the Terrorism Act 2000 and the 2006 Act, is to outlaw things like saying that you support the right of Palestinians to resist Israeli military occupation using armed struggle, which, by the way, is a right enshrined in international law. But
which is exactly what you said earlier, just a little bit ago. And it seems like in the UK, if you said that, that could easily be criminalized.
That's correct. And people have been criminalized for the signs they've held at rallies protesting the genocide in Gaza. They are being criminalized and prosecuted for things they say online, exactly as appears to be the case, or at least the investigation. Asa, I should clarify, was not arrested and was not detained. His house was searched and his devices were seized. But of course, he could be arrested at any time. And this has happened because just in the past couple of months, in August, the freelance journalist Richard Medhurst, who is British, was returning to the UK and was detained at Heathrow Airport and arrested under the Terrorism Act 2000.
Yeah, we had him on our show to talk about that.
Right. So you know about that case. And then just less than 2 weeks later, a well-known activist with a large social media following, Sarah Wilkinson, was also had her home raided and a similar kind of, just abusive process, again for social media posts that had to do with Gaza and Palestine and critical of Israel. And then back in December, ironically, Asa wrote about this for the Electronic Intifada. There are two prominent activists in the UK, Tony Greenstein and Mike Napier, who were arrested and charged with offenses for stating at rallies, at demonstrations, that they support the right of Palestinians to resist. In the case of Tony Greenstein, who is an author, he's written a book recently, and he's also contributed articles to the Electronic Intifada. His bail conditions included being prohibited from posting on Twitter about the conflict in Gaza. So it's that's shocking. Just a taste.
Yeah, I mean,
well, it's shocking. Yeah.
Anyway, but also what enrages me the most about all of this is not that these states are doing it. That doesn't surprise me. What enrages me is that there is an entire portion of the political right in the United States and throughout Western Europe that has been waving the free speech banner for the last 10 years, claiming, I think often validly, that they are the victim of state big tech censorship, who suddenly, because they disagree so vehemently with many of the things you just got done saying, either are silent about it and don't want to mention it, or actively cheer what is happening to you because they finally now confront a view that is being targeted that they dislike with censorship, and they just are incapable of applying these principles. It's like every principle gets waived soon as the topic is Israel.
Well, you're completely right about that, Glenn, but it's not just the political right. It's also the sort of mainstream liberals, because to date, there hasn't been a single report in mainstream media about the raid on Asa. Which should be shocking to anyone. I mean, the liberal principles are supposedly, we can disagree, but we should defend one another's right to hold differing opinions. They don't do that. We haven't seen any coverage from The Guardian or the BBC. Not a single mainstream journalist has come out.
Not even in the UK.
Defended Asa against.
Not even in
Not
the
even.
UK.
I'm talking.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about the UK.
yeah.
I'm talking about the UK. And so it's just totally absent. And this is the UK. But Glenn, I don't know if you also knew that Germany a couple of months ago threatened me with prison and fines for making a speech via Zoom to an audience in Germany. So it's not just the UK. It's across the Western
Oh, totally,
world.
totally.
And
And it's worse in Germany.
yeah,
But it's happening in every country, including the United States. And just to clarify, when I said the political right, what I really meant is the kind of pro-Israel, pro-Zionist part of the right that has just been
yeah.
incredibly hypocritical. There's been a couple of exceptions of people speaking out against some of the more egregious attempts to impose censorship by law against Israel's critics. But for the most part, these people have been waving that flag and have no belief in the actual principle of it. All right, while I have you, let me ask you about the killing of the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, because there's a lot of suggestions, I think, delusionally, that somehow Netanyahu now has an opportunity to end the war as if he wants to. And I remember, just to set the stage for this, back in 2001, shortly after the 9/11 attack, Bill Maher had a show on ABC News, and people were calling the 9/11 hijackers cowards for what they did. And he said, look, you can find what they did reprehensible and despicable, but the one thing you can't say about them is that they're cowards. They gave up their own life for a cause by hijacking planes, flying them into the building, knowing they were going to die. Like, whatever else that is, it's not cowardly. He got fired for that because no one wanted to hear that, even though it was so blatantly true. The IDF released this footage of what they said was Sinwar's last moment, and it was shocking that they did because it showed him in military fatigues, on the front line fighting wars, not hiding in some tunnel as they would try to claim. And even once he had his arm blown off and was bleeding profusely, he still basically, the last thing he did was throw a wooden stick at an Israeli drone that was trying to track him because they were too afraid to enter the house and confront him directly. Which it seems to me like it's going to have a big impact in that region. Not just his assassination, but the way in which he died confronting the Israeli military, even though he had very primitive weapons and they have the most sophisticated ones given by the U.S. What do you think the impact of this will be, first on the Israeli-Gaza conflict, but then in the broader region?
Yeah, there have been these coordinated tweets from the, what should we call them? From the Five Eyes, from, Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Keir Starmer, and others, just celebrating the killing of Yahya Sinwar and demonizing him as this terrible terrorist leader, and the world is better off without him. And, they've just been completely ratioed on Twitter. Nobody is buying that. And I think that highlights the galaxy-sized disconnect between how Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and people across much of the world perceive someone like Yahya Sinwar, as opposed to how he's portrayed in the West or in Israel. He is seen as a resistance hero, as someone who gave his life fighting with his people, himself wearing a vest, carrying a gun for the liberation of his people from a Western-backed, a U.S.-armed regime that is perpetrating genocide. He could not be seen as more legitimate by Palestinians and by the vast, by hundreds or billions of people across the world. And we're seeing that. He already had this incredibly high reputation, which has just been, sent into the stratosphere by the way he died, courageously fighting with his people, for his people, leading from the front. And that's the reality of who Yahya Sinwar was. And the efforts to, we talked about the lies and omissions about October 7th. Of course, the other big one is that on October 7th, Palestinians burned babies and beheaded people and carried out mass rapes, none of which is true. And that's part of the reporting that I've done and the Electronic Intifada has done and Asa Winstanley has done, showing how this is all complete atrocity propaganda and lies that they are trying to turn into reality just by repetition. So the other thing, I mean, if you cast your mind back, Glenn, to mere weeks ago when Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who has arguably even greater status among the people of the region and the world, was killed, there was all this triumphalism and euphoria in the United States and in Israel and the West, like now Lebanon is ours, Hezbollah will crumble, we're going to remake the region in our image. And of course, Hezbollah came out fighting, and the Israelis haven't been able to advance even a few hundred meters into Lebanon, let alone have Israelis go back to the settlements in the north that this operation in Lebanon was supposed to enable them to do. And it will be exactly the same with Hamas. Israel has assassinated Palestinian leaders, and the Zionist movement have assassinated Palestinian and other leaders since the 1930s. And they have assassinated almost every leader of Hamas. Like, leaders of Hamas don't die natural deaths. And they assassinated the two leaders of Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah, he became the leader of Hezbollah in 1992 after Israel assassinated his predecessor. These assassinations have historically only made these movements stronger and more determined. And that's what will happen here. So it's utterly delusional to think that Hamas is just going to collapse and go away. But there is this sort of very shallow Orientalist thinking that the people of the region are simply, mules and sheep who follow behind these strongmen, and not people dedicated deeply to a cause, the cause of their liberation from US-backed imperialism and colonialism.
All right, so speaking of the role of the U.S., and this will be our last question just for time considerations. One of the things that has amazed me, and there's things that I hate that don't surprise me and things that I hate that do, and I've sort of been drawing this dichotomy a few times when I'm talking to you, but there's been a whole sort of horde of left liberal commentators over the last year who have made a lot of money, generated a lot of traffic, drawn a lot of attention to themselves, and fortified their brands as sort of critics of the Democratic Party by constantly calling what's being done in Gaza a genocide, by claiming that Joe Biden and now Kamala Harris are complicit in the genocide, and they've been doing this, strutting around doing all this for 10 months. And then as the election approaches, and then immediately once Kamala Harris is installed, they suddenly forget about all that. And they basically announced that from now on, they're going to pledge to do everything to keep empowered the very people who, for the last 10 months, to their own benefit, they were accusing of being complicit in a genocide. Now, I get the idea that elections, sometimes you have to pick the lesser of two evils, but if genocide isn't the line for you, where somebody commits genocide, then it's just so hard to conceive of how anybody has anything other than a rotted soul who's willing to do that. How do you see the role of the United States government, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and everything that we've been talking about?
To me personally, I speak for myself. The Electronic Intifada doesn't, endorse candidates or take positions on elections. I'm speaking for myself. For me, if genocide, if a Holocaust, which is what the United States and Israel are perpetrating, Holocaust means burning or burnt offering, and we just saw, people being burned alive at the Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir el-Balah, on top of all the whole year of atrocities. If that's not a line for you, nothing is. If you say, yes, genocide, but what about this or what about... There is no but with genocide. That's like saying, yeah, Hitler murdered millions of Jews, but he made the trains run on time. I mean, it's, to me, morally reprehensible. And, I have no fondness. I would say I have nothing but contempt for Donald Trump. And he did terrible things in office, including, continuing the wars in the region that have caused and continue to cause so much devastation. But they try to fearmonger that, Donald Trump will do all these terrible things to you, and he will be even worse to the Palestinians. The simple fact is that, you have to be unwilling to face facts if you can't say that there is nothing Donald Trump did in his 4 years in office that is even remotely as horrifying and criminal and murderous as this genocide that is fully supported by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, or is as murderous and horrific as the illegal aggression and invasion of Iraq, which killed and displaced and destroyed the lives of millions of people, which was done by Dick Cheney, who is now on Team Joe Biden and Team Kamala Harris. If you can't see that, you have just no integrity whatsoever. And I believe that in a democracy, we should have better choices than we have. We have absolutely reprehensible and terrible choices. There are third parties. You've had Jill Stein on your show, and I thought that was an excellent interview. But we have very few viable choices because the system is so rigged. But at a certain point, you have to say, I will not participate. I will not reward those committing a Holocaust. And I'm willing to pay the price because the well-being and comfort of Americans in general, but particularly the American liberals who browbeat us that we have to vote for the people who are burning us alive, burning our friends and family alive, their comfort is not more important to me than the lives of the people in Gaza being burned to death by the bombs and missiles that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are airlifting around the clock to Israel.
Yeah, and they will continue to if Kamala Harris wins the election. She's been very clear about that. And just to sort of add to what you said about the Trump administration, the two wars that Trump inherited, the one that Obama started of aiding Saudi Arabia in its bombing of the Houthis in Yemen, creating a massive catastrophe of humanitarian proportions, and then also the bombing campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Everything that Trump did in that regard, as well as the things he most did to help Israel, like moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, those were the things that the Democrats fully supported. There were very few people criticizing him for that. The only time the media ever really praised Donald Trump was when he shot missiles at Syria. Yeah, and bombed Syria. And so even to the extent that you want to point to these things that Trump did, there's no opposition in the Democratic Party to them. The wing of the Democratic Party, especially represented by Kamala Harris, is going to serve those same foreign policy interests. And, when I look at it, I see that Donald Trump was the first president in decades not to involve the U.S. in a new war. He certainly continued the two wars and even escalated them that he inherited from Obama. Whereas you see under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, these constant involvements of the U.S., including in this horrific massacre in Gaza. So I'm not making the case for Donald Trump in that regard. I'm just saying that even to the extent that you want to look at what Trump did and things you don't like, there's no opposition from the Democratic Party. All right, Ali, really appreciate your coming on. I could have a lot more things, but I want to be respectful of your time and our audience's time. So we'd love to have you back on to talk about the war itself, sort of how it's evolving both in Gaza and Lebanon. Probably there's going to be some retaliation with Iran at some point, and so there'll be a lot to talk about just in terms of the substance. But this authoritarian attempt to target and criminalize journalists who are critical of Israel is incredibly disturbing. And so I appreciate your coming on and talking about that.
Thank you. I'd love to come back on too.
Absolutely. Have a good evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.